Emory Mingo is also a doctoral candidate in the Graduate Division of Religion here at Afrikan University, and her work emerges out of the Ethics and Society Course of Study. And so
So good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I too thank those who've organized this conference and put together this panel. And I'm thankful for my colleagues and for the chair of this panel for the way in which we are hopefully going to be able to engage in some really interesting dialogue after these brief introductory comments that we are each making. This afternoon, I want to focus just for a little bit on what I'm calling keeping the learning and the burning, a reflection on anti-intellectualism in the church and anti-religion in the academy. So it sounds like I got something really together, but these are just introductory comments, okay? So for generations within the Black church, there has been a saying that is at the same time an admonition and a warning. Often persons who have started out in the church and shared their passion for a call to ministry through their preaching, their teaching, their praying, their singing, their dancing, and more, they leave for a period of time to pursue an advanced degree, most often a Master of Divinity degree. And the scene generally goes something like this in a Black church. A young woman or a young man has grown up in a church, much like what Ernest just said, for 18 years or more, and at this point, 20-something years or more, growing up in this church, singing in the choir, sunshine, sunbeam, whatever choir is used, leading the Sunday school class once they've made it to an age where they can actually lead others, praying powerful prayers, calling down on the Spirit to come, dancing with prophetic power, proclaiming the Word of God with power and conviction. And now they've answered a call from God to go into greater service and ministry. So generally what happens is they talk it over with their pastor, they apply to many places. This is of course after they've already gone and gotten an undergraduate degree, so they already know a little something. But they're ready to keep going and trying to grow and learn more. And so a way has finally been made for them to attend seminary, where they will focus normally for 3 years of their life in the academic preparation for ministry. The young person is then generally celebrated by the church on their final day with the congregation before leaving for graduate school. This has been some of y'all's story, right? Just wink your eye. And so you get celebrated by this church that has nurtured you, that has brought you together, that has been watching you since you were 2- and 3-year-old, giving your Easter speeches and your Christmas speeches. And they've known that the hand of God was on your life for a long time. And so the old men come up and they give you a firm handshake and say, you know, I'm going to call ahead for you because I know some preachers up that way and I want you to go to their church. That's happening. And so then the plate gets passed around and a love offering is collected, right? Because you got to have a little gas money and a little snack money while you're on your way to seminary. And so all of the nickels and the dimes and the crunched up, rolled up dollars all get put into this basket so that you can have your love offering. And then a little old lady who is highly respected in the church motions you over to their pew. You know how they do it, or maybe you don't, but they have this way of doing it. They don't have to say anything, but you know it's time for you to come and sit down next to her. And so she folds up some dollars and some peppermints and puts them in your hand and puts her hand over your hand. And she looks you in the eye and she says, now baby, you go get the learning, but don't you lose that burden. And you know what that means. Or at least you think you know what that means. This is what happens to so many people as they are walking this path where they have had this passionate connection and involvement within their local church, and it's now time for them to go out into this dangerous world where they could potentially lose the burden that they have, this fire for God, this fire for the Lord, this fire and passion for religion and spirituality. So baby, go get the learning, but don't lose the burning. The church mother's admonition to get the learning and not lose the burning sets the stage for alienation within two communities, the academy and the church. The learning or the academic preparation and understanding received through graduate study is often embraced by those who have also had a chance to pursue opportunities of higher learning. The ability to understand sacred texts and religious history is welcomed in most church congregations, where they want a preacher who can break it down and quote some Hebrew for them and say a few words in Greek that they might not fully understand, but they know something. That's welcomed most times. The religious leader who has gone to a great institution to study becomes a point of prestige within the communities that their members are a part of. You know, my pastor went to so-and-so. My pastor has 4 degrees. I don't know what they all are, but my pastor has a lot of degrees. That becomes a point of prestige in some communities. But getting the learning is juxtaposed with losing the burning. Losing the fire that is within them to do the work that God has called them to do without reservation. Losing the burning happens when students become disillusioned after learning that their Sunday school lessons barely scratch the surface of the knowledge that is available. Losing the learning happens when questioning and being critical creates discomfort and fear of no longer having the pillars of faith securely in place. Getting the learning means going beyond what is known at home and opening oneself up to other ideas and epistemologies. But it threatens losing the burning, losing the fire within. Within some large churches today, with leaders who have not done critical studies of religion through strong academic work, there is an anti-intellectualism that can be heard from the pulpit and often reiterated in the pews and the parking lots. It is heard in the side comments belittling those who went to seminary. To seminary. That's how it happens. Oh, you know, you don't need to follow those people that went to seminary. Seminary. Doing it intentionally to belittle the academic preparation that those who have committed themselves to that work have done. Or it's in the forced efforts of those who have been exposed to greater knowledge to dumb down their sermons and their teaching, often intentionally using improper grammar and making it a point instead of increasing the knowledge base of the whole congregation. And so you'll hear verbs split intentionally. You'll hear subjects and verbs not agreeing with each other, and then it gets pointed out, ain't, don't do that. That's right, I said ain't. As an intentional way of dumbing down the prophetic message and the intellectual vigor in which they could do the preparation for the sermon. And so this anti-intellectualism also takes the form of not supporting those in ministry who do want to go beyond the teachings of the local church and the church's school of ministry. This anti-intellectualism is based on a fear, and it's crippling to many. It's important to note, however, that anti-intellectualism is not limited to the church, and it's not a new phenomenon. This language has been used within America for at least over 50 years because it found its way into the American vernacular through Richard Hofstadter's 1963 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, in which he traces this unfortunate trend from the 18th century through the mid-20th century, where the idea of plain sense being superior to formal knowledge and expertise takes center focus within that text. Long text, if you haven't read it, great work to try to at least put within all of the many other things that you're going to want to read within your life. But anti-religion is also not limited to the academy. Very often, those of us who come into this space, who have burning and learning, find ourselves in alienated body. It's been since at least the age of the Enlightenment that there's been this turn away from religion and an embrace of science and other forms of reason. And so what causes anti-intellectualism? I'd say fear. Loss of power, loss of authority, loss of respect among membership in the face of those who have more academic preparation. And then what causes this anti-religion or this anti-faith within the academy? Often it's personal experiences of doubt, unscientific or non-rational support of beliefs that just can't be bought. I just don't understand it. I just can't make sense of it. And so that religion that you want to hold on to, that faith that you think is so important, it just doesn't make sense, so it must not be right. And so we have an anti-religion and an anti-faith. And so those of us who find ourselves committed to both the academy and the church find ourselves as alien bodies in both spaces and in both places. As people of African descent, and based on all the research and knowledge that we know, that means all of us in this room, we are people for whom there has traditionally been no separation between the sacred and the secular. Because there is an understanding that there is no place where God is not. And so to try to fracture our bodies in a way that we can only be religious in one space and only be intellectual in another space creates an alien existence for many of us. As an active member in the oldest black denomination, I'm a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. We take our founding back to 1787, but the official, whatever we call it, incorporation would be in 1816. By either stretch, we're still the oldest black denomination in America. And it has a very global presence. We've got churches not only here in America, within the Caribbean, within Europe, within Africa, and we also have churches now in India, so we now also have them in Asia. We also have a very historic focus on education and social and political activism. And so I find it very interesting as a member of this church, who was a freedom church, as Reverend Ernest mentioned, who founded based on stepping out and speaking out and making change in the midst of all kinds of other things. I find it interesting that it's a struggle for me to be an academic in my own space and in my own church. I find it interesting that many of my colleagues, when I go back to my annual conferences for my denomination, they find my work interesting, or at least what they think they know about my work, they find it interesting. And so then I get put on display once a year when I have to go back to annual conference. Oh, and here comes our PhD student, is what gets announced. Oh, and she's back. She came all the way back to come back to this meeting, right? You shaking your head. That's happening to you too? And so we get put on display as the one odd intellectual person who also still comes back to these church spaces to answer the role and to do all of the things that the denomination requires. Very often, when I go back to these spaces, my colleagues are not quite sure what to say or what to do or how to interact with me. They have a degree too, but they just don't feel like it's adequate enough, but they try hard. So they quote all of these things that they know. They mention all of the people that they've studied. They talk about what book they are reading now. I often doubt that they're currently reading it because they can't go very deep when I begin to say other things. And so they want to prove that what they are doing is just as good, so that I'm not this one person that gets highlighted as the one intellectual that has come back to the meeting. They also often come and tell me 4 years in a row at times of how they're going to go and get a PhD too. You know, I'm thinking about getting a PhD about it. Because I like the Old Testament. Most folks, or I like the New Testament. And they tell me this year after year as if it's going to mean something different to me this time because I'm hearing it again, and so they must be sure of it. Now, they don't know any languages. They don't know any of the biblical languages. They haven't prepared in any way, but yet they're going to go and get their PhD too because they are serious about this academic pursuit. I find it all interesting to sit in a historic black denomination that again is focused on history, it's focused on social protest, it's focused on political protest, but it very interestingly has been focused on education since our early days with a requirement for clergy to be educated. Requirement, it's within our discipline, it's within our guidelines that it is required that we must especially now. Now, in the earlier days, it was required that you go and get some form of education. And then it was required that you get an undergraduate education. Then it was required that you get a master's. And then that requirement was taken back. And then in 1996, it was brought back again, where the requirement now remains that you must have an undergraduate degree and a master's of divinity degree from an accredited American Theological Seminary place before you can become ordained. But as an ordained black clergywoman in the academy, I often find this a place of alienation also. So as I sit in classrooms, as I sit around seminar spaces, as I go to conferences to present, there's often the, do you really believe that? Is that what so you actually believe that? You're not just going to write about it and talk about it. I even had a couple sisters who are also in the academy, both have PhDs in religion, and they saw me at a church, and I was on my way to another church, because that's just what I do on Sundays. I don't know what other people might wash their cars or go play golf or, you know, go to the mall. I go to church. It's what I do. And so one of them, I found it very interesting that she said, well, what are you going through that you've got to go to church so much? It alienates me, and it alienates my body in that space. So there's also the alienation that happens on both sides, where very often we hear this in other professions, that those who can't do teach. And so maybe she just can't preach. Maybe she's just not cut out to pastor. That must be why she's going to teach. It can't be that this is the area in which my ministry is to take its place. It must be that something else is wrong. So then I get so when are you going to take your church? And if you say that that you're not going to, then well, what about all those gifts that I see? I see you. You'll be a great pastor. But I love to hear you preach. You will be great. When are you going to take your church? What can't we put you on a list as a candidate? I don't know how many times I've had to turn that down. I'm not called to pastor. And I'm fine with that, and it's not my problem that you're not. So how are those with commitments to both the church and the academy to live out our full lives without being constantly forced to fragment our being? I regularly encounter spaces of contestation of this and places that create alienation in the classroom, in the pulpit, in academic journals, in denominational journals, in side and parking lot conversations, both for the academy, within the academy, and within the church. Within the academy, even in the field of religion, I find it interesting that despite the rigor of writing, publishing in a denominational journal or denomination-centered journals most often don't count towards any form of academic success, even in the field of religion. The critical learning has been relegated to a specific place within the ivory tower. And critical learning and engagement gets ostracized from other spaces. And I use this just an example of a place where critical work is happening. This is called the A.M.E. Review. It's been the scholarly tradition within the A.M.E. Church since 1884. Consistently published since 1884. The editor of this journal now is Dr. Teresa Fry-Brown, who is a professor here at Emory. She's also now the historiographer, editor of the review, and the director of research for the A.M.E. Church. The only woman to sit in such a position ever within my denomination. And within this work, you have those of us who are a part of what we call the A.M.E. scholars, all either with their PhDs or like me about to get it soon, writing critical work, writing really engaging work. But does it get recognized by the academy? Absolutely not. I dare not put that on my CV and expect to get anything or have anybody take me seriously. And that means that my body becomes alien in that space. And my work becomes alien in that space. Just a little bit more, I figure we got that. And I'm trying to take your time.
You keep right on.
Yeah, I need some calling responses. The anti-intellectualism within my denomination takes an interesting form, since again, having a Master's of Divinity is required. And so it takes the form of someone sometimes questioning people like me who, and I say it like this, so anti-intellectualism does not mean that they don't believe, that some of the pastors or some of those who are going into ministry don't believe that a degree is necessary. They know it's necessary. Then the next level of alienation and the next level of critique and ostracism becomes, so why you gotta go way over there? Why couldn't you just come to ITC? Why couldn't you just go to Turner like I did, which is our denomination, or one of our denomination seminaries? I went to Princeton Theological Seminary. And so when I would fly back from New Jersey, spending my money to go back to answer the roll and say my little memory verse, because that's what's required of me. I would get the question by some of the older preachers, well, oh, you couldn't go to Turner? You were too good for Turner? Or why'd you go to that white school? And so it becomes another form, right? Because there's still that fear there. There's still that unknown there. There's still that you're going to challenge and push me in ways because of what you've now been exposed to that I'm not ready to deal with. And so it creates this interesting dilemma for someone like me. Because not only do I get asked, why did you go to that school? As if I don't have good sense and can't pick my own places for education. But then, so why you want to go get a PhD? Why wouldn't you go ahead and start pastoring? Because surely that must be the only thing that's worth anything within religion and faith. And how are you going to rise up within our denomination if you're not a pastor? It creates a dilemma for me, right? So I have this interesting space that I have to try to work things out in, because in the place in which I was raised, the place in which I was brought up and nurtured, and I was a global officer for my denomination, so I've gone as high up as we can go. I still get those questions, and they know me. And they've known me for all of my life. They know that the burning is not gone just because I've gotten a little bit of learning. And yet I still do this, and yet I still have to walk in these dual worlds and try to figure out my way along the way. I'm thankful, though, to have had models of women who've gone before me. Not only women like Jarena Lee, who we often celebrate as one of the first women in my denomination to request the right to preach. She was not the first. Her own writings tell us that she was not the first. There was a woman who went before her and was denied, that Richard Allen tells her about. And then she is the one that we know the most. But it starts there with pushing to have the voice heard, and pushing to have the call acknowledged, and pushing to have the space, all the way through women like Dr. Teresa Fry Brown, who's still doing this thing, still dancing between the academy and the church, and doing it in ways that at times I'm sure places her in a place of alienation. And so I'm thankful for women like Reverend Geraldine Singletary, who was the woman who was preaching on one day that I heard in a Sunday school convention, and it was in her message that I heard God's voice. And it was in her message that I made my own choice then for how I would live my life. And then on that next Sunday, I went to my church where my pastor was Reverend Thelma Shaw Young, another woman, who I walked down the aisle and made my commitment before my congregation and God for my personal walk. And so I'm thankful to have had models like those women to show me one side. But there's still a need for models on this other side, where I still walk into classrooms and it's, do you really believe that? Or I feel as if I can't say it all because it will be questioned. I will be looked at differently as not being as academically focused. I've been sat down by professors for being told that I'm doing too much in the church. Now granted, they've never been to my church, so they don't know what I do. They make assumptions that simply because I go, I must be doing too much. And that's a problem for me because it makes me fragmented in many other ways. So as a woman who walks into, as a woman with support and advocacy within my own denomination, my explanation that I am not called to pastor is often misinterpreted as I must be afraid to pastor. As a woman who walks into the pulpit in the fullness of my womanhood, I wear custom robes. You will never see me in something big and bulky and looking like a man. I have had women come and talk about the height of my heels, or my lack of hose during warmer months, or the length of my skirt, or the richness of the color of my lipstick, or the form-enhancing design of my robe, and more. My body gets alienated even in those other spaces. And because I'm this oddball, I must not know any better, right? Because I'm this person who's coming from the academy, I must not know any better. This is when I'm in the space here in Atlanta, not in the place in which I grew up, so they just think I must be different. Yet those of us who take another way find ourselves alienated within both the denominations that we are a part of and within the academy in which we are called to. Generally, within my denomination specifically, Those of us who take this route, who take this other way, we aren't allowed to be elected as clergy to the General Conference, which is our biggest ordaining body where all of the decisions are made. Why? Because only pastors get that. If I'm clergy and I'm not a pastor, then I really just don't exist in many ways. Generally, we aren't the ones asked to preach the significant services within large denominational meetings, because those are unofficially reserved for pastors. Just as another quick anecdotal example, at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, which is a conference of primarily black preachers, but not solely black preachers, but it is designed and committed to social activism within the church. And a couple of years ago, I was given the opportunity to present Dr. Fry Brown to that body for the first time to preach. And I did what I do, you know, I laid it out. They needed to know who she was, and so I made sure that they did, and she was very celebrated, and she did what she does very well. And so then afterwards, all of these young male seminary students from an institution here in Atlanta came running over to me because they didn't think they could go directly to her, asking, man, I need to take her class. Can I sign up for her class? She seems great. Now beforehand, you've been in this same city with this same woman, with the same opportunity to take these classes for years. But until you now see her elevated in this space, now you think that she's worth your time and that you might be able to learn something from her. And so we find ourselves in these odd spaces. How do you then respond to this young person? Because she had to find some creative ways. How do you then respond to these not so young people? Because many of those men were not. And then also finding our ways in odd spaces where pastors will invite you in once, and then after you in your preaching and your teaching challenge them to have to do better in what they do to preach and to teach, you never get invited back again, regardless of the response from the people, regardless of the ways in which fruit is good. You're smiling and laughing, it's true, right? And so how then do we, as those who live in these dual worlds, in the academy and in the church, as I close here, the challenge becomes finding a way to be our full selves, ones who desire to keep both the learning and the burning in constructive tension with each other, so that we can do the work that we are called to do, both in the academy and in the church. So that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Reverend Mingo, for your comments. It is now 12:36. We have a good 45 minutes for discussion, and so many questions came to me. I have a few anecdotes I want to tell myself. I wonder if I could. What I thought would be good. It did open up a lot for me as well, and I would like to share with you, but I thought I would like the other two panelists to engage you and vice versa, to give you a chance to, in case you have questions for one another. But let me just respond with a few thoughts that I've had. I mean, I'm so glad that Reverend Mingo did reflect on the alienation that happens on this side of the divide between church and academy. Because I think from our spaces in the academy, we like to do a lot of critique on what the church is not allowing, what is not opened up in the church. But I think it's very important to think about how we can create an environment for real dialogue, not just response out of our deeply profound aesthetic approach to the religious experience. I call it response is about moving with the aesthetic rhythms of life, of the breath of life, and that is a vivifying and renewing experience in and of itself. But we are also thinkers, right? We're also thinkers who deserve to reflect on this experience of what it means to be part of a believing and practicing community. So how do we do that? And I think we ask that a lot from the seminary location, but I have always believed that pedagogically, we don't create the actual courses that allow for that. We are too conservative in the way we approach courses. We don't do theory praxis coursework at the seminary level that really allow us to test, experiment with ways of bringing these two communities together. So a couple of things came to mind for me. I began to think, particularly as Reverend Brooks. Okay, because I wanted to say Reverend Ernest, because particularly as Reverend Brooks was speaking, I began to think about some of my experiences in seminary, where my advisor, Professor James Cone, whom everyone knows as the father of Black theology, and I went to Union at a time when Dolores Williams was on staff. She was like my co-advisor. Dr. Vison was there. Dr. James Washington was very instrumental in my development before he passed away. So I feel very fortunate to have been taught by them. But I remember being in Dr. Cone's ecclesiology class. This was many years ago. I've been teaching for 17 years. This was a long time ago. And Dr. Cone said at one point, the reason the Black church, in general, is so conservative is because it doesn't believe that Christianity is really its religion. And kind of like when you join something new, you follow the rule book that they give you. You know, you kind of follow the rule number 1 says, we can't be in the woods doing our brush arbor services anymore. We have to line up in pews. Rule number 2 says, we need hymn books. Rule number 3 says, and it was a very, very profound statement, that we really don't believe it's our religion. And it also made me reflect on some of what I was learning in my broader history of Christian thought classes, that when the Reformation was really getting underway, one of the reasons the liturgical space and the liturgical rituals developed the way they did in the Protestant church was because we were dealing with primarily an illiterate population. And in order for the broader population to actually experience the Word of God, it had to be preached. So no longer a 10-minute homily, a 20-minute sermon. And so the church at the time looked at the needs of its congregation, its environment, and I always felt, why doesn't the Black church do that? You know, why doesn't the Black church look at its needs and really take the authority to reform its own liturgical space? I've heard Reverend Sampson and other places talk about space, distance from the congregation, height from the congregation. Why don't we do that? I'm sure some churches probably are, but why isn't that more standardized? So those were some thoughts that came to my head. Another thought was, I do a lot of work on African heritage religions and their impact upon African diaspora religious experiences, Christian and others. And I did a Fulbright fellowship in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, for 1.5 years. And for some Christian contexts, I might be a little bit too out there because I am very interested in indigenous spirituality. I want to know everything about it. And so all of a sudden, I found out that these conservative theological seminaries were inviting me to give talks. And I was thinking, really? They want to hear from me? And of course, I wasn't going to say no. One was for Women's History Month. They wanted me to talk about Pauline scriptures and women's, the approach, the attitude toward women. I said, I haven't done biblical studies in like 13 years. But I said, I'm going. I am going. And I had pictures of Tarina Lee. I had pictures of Ida Wells Barnett. I had pictures of Black women who were church women, Nanny Helen Burroughs. I passed them around and I talked about these women because I didn't want them to think I was making it up. I later found out, at the time my last name was Stewart, my official last name, that when they heard Dianne Stewart, they expected like a 50-year-old white woman to walk in the door. And here I walk in, I'm of African descent, I'm wearing their clothing, African clothing, head wrapped, everything. And I found out, they were just enamored by me as well, like, oh, she looks like us, she's so young. I'm not that young. She's so young, she's, So I would go. And I would get into these very interesting conversations, and I found myself telling a group of young students at one point, and they would keep inviting me back. It was so interesting. If I were an architect, or a lawyer, or a doctor, or an engineer, and you asked me a question about my guild, about my field, and I answered it in exactly the way you would answer it, you would be so disappointed. You would be totally disappointed. You would say, your education hasn't served you, you haven't told me anything I don't know. I said, but I went to seminary and divinity school for 7 years. And I think differently about the Bible. I think differently about Christian theology, and I should. But when I answer differently, that is a problem. For some reason, my training, my expertise should not come to the fore because I must think exactly the way the party line answer should be for persons of faith. So I did. I tried to push them and tried to help them to see that there are a range of possibilities when we're dealing with biblical interpretation, when we're dealing with church formation in different cultural contexts, etc. So it was always a very fascinating engagement, and I loved them, and I enjoyed it. But I find myself having to say that from time to time. At the same time, I do want to push back on us in the Academy and ask, we have now, since 1968, 69, we have over, almost 50 years of reflection from African-American trained scholars in religion and theology. And we have good proposals on the table. Why is it that we have not been able to implement in a wider framework our proposals within our church congregations? I know that's a perennial question. It's not fair to put that on you, but I would love for us to have some reflection on that. What about reforming our liturgical spaces? What needs to happen to do it? Where is it happening? And what's the impact? Because I'm not assuming that no churches are doing it. Where are the model churches? And why can't those models become more widespread? How can we think about that? I have one other question. I'm just going to put this last one on the table, because I think it's interesting to think about. When I listen to the kinds of sexist practices that are still, in some ways, endemic in a lot of Black church circles, I keep asking myself, and other exclusionary practices, where did they come from? What sustains them? Are these practices grounded in traditions of biblical interpretation? Is that what it is? Or is there a more popular, perhaps evangelical theology that has come to the fore that is reinforcing certain kinds of interpretations? Is it coming from our own cultural and social heritages of being in America or our African heritages? I'm asking because I know a lot of African feminists are increasingly interrogating those Western feminist notions that African cultures are so intrinsically sexist. I mean, some of them are actually showing that absolutely, no, they're not. They're actually quite gender neutral, and many more flexible options for conceiving gender and sexuality in a lot of African cultures, particularly pre-colonial, pre-Islamic influence. So that's why I'm asking. And I think I'll stop there, and I would like to just give the panelists a chance to either respond to anything I've put on the table or to one another, if there are any comments you want to say, to raise to one another, and then open it up to the audience.
So right on the table. As I was listening to you, Mingo, talk about your experience and this kind of approach to looking at this tension between the church and the academy, and where we as people who kind of find ourselves in those spaces, where we fit. I couldn't help but think about my own experience, and I joked that was a therapy session. It was much needed. But I began reflecting on my own experiences and how I've been shaped by that. And I thought about I pastored during my seminary education, and at the conclusion of my time in the master's program, I was called into one of the African American faculty members' office, and they said, "We've been watching you, and we really want you to apply to the PhD program, and we need to make sure that we have strong Black scholars in the program, X, Y, and Z." He said, "But there's a problem." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "You have identified primarily as a minister and a pastorate," and he said that the challenge is that our colleagues look down upon that. And he advised, he said, if you plan on applying to PhD program, doing PhD work, do your best to play down your experience of the church and at least give the sense that you have no interest in a career in the church, because we aren't going to want to invest in you as a PhD student and then take your education and instead of staying in the academy, go back to the church, as if it was this either-or conversation. And at that moment, I decided that I was not going to pursue a PhD. Left there and went back to the church. and found myself in this space where the combination of pastoring a church, being in a graduate program at the same time was fulfilling for me. It was, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. But once I finished the master's program, found myself in the church full time, I found that intellectual side of me lacking. And so then I found myself back in an academic space, being able to do both, and now kind of committing to re-engage and figuring out a way to do both. But it was interesting, recently I was wrestling with whether or not to stay in this academic space or to go back into the pulpit. And I ultimately decided to stay in the academic environment. But one of my good friends and mentors called me and told me, he said, "No, I know you've made a decision, to stay here, to do doctoral work, but he said, make sure that you're doing some interim pastorates or you're doing something on the side. So just in case you decide that you want to pastor, that you have that on your resume, so that, people will want," he said that, "we want to see that you've been connected." And it really, I appreciated the advice because it's real, but it rubbed me the wrong way because, I would say the person that I am, the person that I was when I was pastoring a church, the person that I am in the academy is the same person. And so why do I have to prove who I am all over again every time I try to engage one or the other? And so that really, I don't have the answer, but that really kind of honed it in for me that there is something there. The other thing, to your point about the models, one of the things that we do at Morehouse with our chapel assistants, we have services every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock. That's a plug for all of you all who are interested. But really to see how in an academic environment we allow our students to lead worship in a way that allows them to work through some of these conversations about how to be an intellectual in the church, how to be committed to the church but then have intellectual engagement in a space that it's okay to try to experiment with both. And some Sundays it's more intellectual, some Sundays it's more, kind of congregational, and that's okay. It gives them that space. But after every service, no matter whether it's a student preacher, a guest preacher, the dean or myself, we always have what we call a sermon talk back. And we go into the chapel library, and it may be 20 or 30 students, and they get to engage the preacher, ask questions about the sermon, but invariably it turns into a vocational conversation. How did you get to where you are? How did you study? How do you balance being a scholar and a minister? These are the kind of questions they're wrestling with. But I offer that as a potential model, not just for academic settings, but even for the church. I often ask myself as a pastor, what would it mean if once a month, we invited a different guild or a different group within the church to have a sermon talk back with the pastor? What if next week the women's Bible study got to come and engage the pastor, or the following week the members of the usher board got to stay after for lunch and discuss with the pastor the sermon? But also these other questions that church members have about who you are, what you do Monday through Friday, how you use your education in the pulpit. If we're able to have these kind of dialogical spaces, in the church, I think that it would be a learning experience not only for the congregation, but for the clergy. Because I'm a firm believer that the more you engage your congregation and the more that you understand their lives and their lifestyles and the questions that they're wrestling with, the more that you will appreciate them as thinkers. The highlight of my time serving the church was not Sunday mornings, but it was the Bible studies. And very quickly I realized that the congregation that was largely an unlettered congregation in a rural community was expecting me to bring what I was studying to the table. They wanted to know what books I was reading, what concepts I was engaging. And the more I pushed them, the more I threw at them, the more I got engagement from them that was really just as, if not more critical than some of the conversations that we were having in the classroom. And it really got me to really think and to understand that part of the challenge within the church is not that the congregations aren't willing to engage, aren't willing to be critical. We as trained and educated clergy have a responsibility not to look down upon our congregations and to think that they aren't ready or can't handle the conversations that we want to bring to bear on the church. And then also we can't be afraid to go there to have these conversations. I have friends who say, yeah, I hear you, but I'd never bring that up in my church. I'd never have that conversation. Well, if you never bring it up, you're never going to get to where it is, you want to go. And finally, the other kind of situation, an issue that your remarks, that your feedback and your remarks brought up, was something that I've been dealing with recently. I'm a member of a group here in Atlanta called the Progressive Theology Leadership Group. It's about 30 members, mostly laity. I'm one of the only ordained members of this group, one of the only African Americans, and it's a group of disaffected, wealthy, white congregants, mostly from the kind of Buckhead, Episcopal, and Presbyterian churches. And they've organized themselves and gather monthly in each other's homes to kind of talk about things that they don't feel like they can talk about in the churches. And I was invited by a colleague and really just kind of joined the group and was invested in it. And it's interesting because you cross all of these spaces, race, gender, economics, culture, and I find a home there, ironically, because I can engage in conversations that I haven't been able to engage in my own space. But then there's also the pushback there, the challenge of when you go into those spaces, the assumption that, we thought that all black preachers and, people, in African American religious traditions are conservative, they're over-emotional, they're anti-intellectual, and so the moment you say something in that circle, people's eyes are and say, oh wow, you're the smart one, you're the good one, you're the one that we can bring in, and it leaves this discomfort. You wanted to say, I appreciate, being able to engage this space, but I've got to challenge some of those notions. And then, I had one of the members tell me, you really don't need to be in a church. We need to figure out, how we can get you in some kind of a space that, that allows you to think broadly and to explore. As if the assumption is that I couldn't do that, within the church. And so I brought that up to say that it's not just in the church that we're having these conversations, or even in the academy, but in these other spaces, that the assumptions are being made about what it means to be a scholar, what it means to be a minister, but then also all of these race and class dynamics that play in it.
I want to, may I open it up to the audience now?
I just wanted to respond to,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let me take a few from the floor, and then we'll pull you back in. Yes, are there questions? I saw one here. Can we hear both of them, and we'll hear from you first, and say your name?
My name is Manny Rivers. I have a question that's informing here on the paper in a complex way. I want to start with, I'm really interested in like the pressure to feel accepted, or to feel like you have agency in spaces, or agency or relative power or voice in multiple spaces, right? Particularly as a marginalized body, right? To be able to move to different spaces, and that everything you guys kind of talked about, so that'd be great. I'm really interested, and I wonder, is it possible? And this is probably deeply a foundational kind of question, but is it possible that an alien or alien body can attain any sort of agency in a space that is structurally, anti-alien? It's structurally anti-dialogical, structurally, where pulpit congregation, teachers, students, kind of thing. And I really like the points that with talkbacks, because I think that's one way to break down that structure. And I come from the theater, and that was one of the ways that the theater provided its answer to create more dialogue, because once the play is over, is it now done, or can we talk back, And so, but it's a deeply foundational kind of question. I wonder, if it's possible, and the talkback is kind of one thing kind of brought to mind, but are there other ways, that's really, really possible for bodies that are marginalized and and will continue to be in multiple spaces, almost all spaces in this society, particularly black bodies, right, or women bodies, or gender, racial bodies, whatever. So I want to be able to talk about that.
I think
Let me
that,
just hear the other question, just in case it overlaps, or we can hear a couple of.
It was actually a couple comments and I have a question at the end. The first one was actually directed to you, Dr. Diakite. You were discussing Dr. Cohn's comment about, my name is Mingo, by the way, I'm a graduate student at Houston. You're discussing Dr. Cohn's comment about sort of this juncture between Christianity and blackness. It seems to occur within the context. I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts about, because he's not the first to say this, right? Joseph Washington wrote a couple of articles about this kind of, and so I would love to, and he got backlash for saying some of the things that he said from black Christian scholars, pretty much.
You're mentioning Joseph Washington.
Joseph Washington, right? And he got backlash for saying, for raising the question, are black churches really Christian? I don't think that they are, right? But there's something much more folksy going on. Zorman Hurst has discussed this before. I mean, we have, and so I would love to hear your response to that. And then just a couple other things. Melva, well, Reverend Sampson.
no, I appreciate it. No, it's so fine.
I apologize, but I do apologize for
I
that.
appreciate the respect. No,
But I just wanted to know, you were discussing the notion of alienation within the context of the pulpit as it relates to black female bodies. And I was wondering if you've read the text, Say Jesus and Come to Me by Anne Shockley. And if you haven't, this question becomes extremely irrelevant, but if you have, the protagonist, she embraces this kind of masculinity, which she's a female preacher and she's a female lesbian preacher. And when she gets in the pulpit, she's extremely kind of masculine in the way she handles herself. But at the same time, embraces her femininity such though that she loves both her own female body and the female bodies of other women. And she sort of, there's something interesting about that. But, because it's not a well-read text, so I just came to mind.
I am not, but I certainly just wrote down.
Oh yeah, I would love that. Once you do, your work is so interesting to me. I would love to dialogue further.
I'd love to talk to you more.
Yeah, we can. And Reverend Mingo, this is actually the question I do have for you, and it's kind of anecdotal, so I'll try to be brief with it. I went to Vanderbilt I'm actually in a PhD student, religious studies PhD in life. That's what I'm doing. Fumbling over my words, but I went to Vanderbilt to get my MTS. And one day I got a really close friend there. He and I became best friends. And he left. He got an MDiv, and so he's pastoring, or he's on the pastoral staff at his father's church in the Full Gospel Conference. So I know you pretty much will. So we had this conversation one day, and I'm here in the academy, and I've been raising questions. Sandy Hook happened. I raised a question of theodicy. I said churches really need to think seriously about theological responses to suffering, and it can't just be, well, God willed this, right? That can't be the answer that is produced. And one of the things I said was either God can or God won't. Take your pick and think about it, right? And process theologians have already said God can, right? And you have, Boston personalism who said maybe God won't. There's ways of thinking it, but I would bring that up to say that he called me up and he said, I just want to let you know, like, you're a bubble, like, you are an academic who you don't connect what you think to what's actually happening in the real lived lives of people, real lived experiences of people in congregations. And it struck as dissonant to me because he was with me at Vanderbilt, right? He knows the kind of literature that I read, but he told me that he intentionally now kind of downplays that, right? And he got his MDiv and he said, you know what, this kind of doesn't work for my congregation. And the reality is that I'm not quite sure it doesn't work for his congregation. I just don't know if he thinks that they're prepared for it to work, right? So that's the one side of dissonance. So I would love to hear you respond to that. Are academics really in a bubble? And to a certain extent, I do agree with him. We do have terms like epistemology and these sort of weird big words that people don't read. But the flip side of this is that should we mistake critical questions for anti-religious questions, right? And this is the question I have for you specifically, because you're right, you can't feel alienated if you have belief systems, but if we take, for example, the Sandy Hook shooting, it becomes, particularly for religious studies scholars and theologians, to raise the question, what does this particular tradition really have to offer? Critically ask this question, what does the tradition really have to offer theologically to a kind of an event of senseless violence like that, or the sort of numerous deaths in Chicago that we don't discuss as well? It seems to me that we can ask this question, and if it moves us to a place that's uncomfortable, right? Because I'll be honest with you, it was precisely in divinity school where I started quote unquote, we call it losing our Jesus, right? That's what they said. And so what we
Let somebody take your Jesus.
don't let nobody take your Jesus away, right? So we have we had this constructive theology class, and we started talking about the Trinity, and I said, this Trinity stuff is not making sense. 3 and 1, I can't do the math, just not working out. But anyway, that was a starting point for me, having this junction, moving away from a traditional understanding of God. And so in doing that, people said, you're losing your Jesus or your God. And, you know, I recognize that was me critically questioning, not anti-faith, but being critical of faith in a sort of Anselmian way where faith seeks understanding. And sometimes that understanding takes you to a place, takes you to somewhere else. And so I wonder, is it really anti-religion, or is it, and there are spaces where it is anti-religion, but are we really dealing with anti-religion overall in the academy, or are we dealing with a critical disposition towards some of these long-held religious traditions? So hopefully I opened up, I didn't mean to say all of that, but I did want to just open it up for that kind of dialogue.
So we have the question about structure and alien bodies. The question, do we really have to radically revolutionize our very structures in order to achieve full inclusivity and participation in dialogue? Does anyone want to respond?
I'm going to try to make it sweet. I realize our time is, so I want to make it sweet and get to something. I want to tie structure into Dr. Diakite's challenging the liturgical practices. And so my immediate response is, you know, is there ever a space in which an alien body would have agency, considering the problematic nature of the system or the structure? My gut response is no. My gut response is, you know, you have to, in some ways, throw out and start over. But that connects me to sort of these spaces and places that are challenging particular types of liturgical practices. So for the faith community that I'm affiliated with, that is precisely what has been done. And I would say that the faith community that I'm affiliated with is an entire alien body in terms of its belief, its stance. It can be questioned how we can say we're Christian, if we say we're Christian, but it is coming from that particular place of questioning, this really isn't ours. And if this isn't ours, then we have to create what is ours based on what we're able to piece together through our African heritage religions, as well as opening up broader lines of communication, of cultural acceptance and understanding and work, not being fearful of and embracing these particular bodies. And that's fearful. That is fearful for a lot of people. That is fearful for people to get that and to come. I think about in the academy where we're sitting, where in some instances I'm too academic for the church, but in many instances I'm not academic enough for the academy. So in some instances, you know, I can communicate just well or just fine in the church, but in the academy, I can't communicate well enough. I mean, and so there's almost as if there is either this and or. And so with those, and I'm sure Dr. Diakite and others who are more seasoned can speak to this dichotomy or this binary system, who have, I'm not, because this is on tape, I'm not saying Dr. Diakite has critiqued this. These are my words. I'm a two-tenure now, so. But the critique of the academy of what's useful and what's not useful, right? And so how to do it differently, but still being held by particular standards, because this is what you're going to be judged by doing. So you're kind of, it's almost like a psychotic break, really. I mean that. If you, because you are trying to, as AnnMarie said, you are trying to fragment yourself. You are trying to, at one level, critique these standards, but then create new standards by which, you know, you can have some semblance of, I'm being true to myself, I'm being true to the communities that I desire to represent or speak to, and I just don't know if that can be done. It can, well, we have to go through this process, right? So the big advice is, well, you have to get what you need to move through. You can't make change on the outside, right? So you have to first obtain, and you have to first get all of the knowledge, and then you change. And that is something that I'm really thinking about deeply, because I don't know, it seems like many of the people that I've seen do that have not been able to make that type of change. And when they do, they are marginalized even more. So their marginalized body now sits outside of another, on the periphery of another set of marginal groups. Yes, please.
I want to ask you if you could name one or two specific liturgical or ecclesial practices of your church, because some people might not be. Yeah, I'm just curious if you could just name as examples.
So, for instance, our church service, I attend First African Presbyterian Church. We are Presbyterian in order, in terms of following the Presbyterian Book of Order, according to ordination and according to all of the things that require